The wind was sharp against my face as I sat alone on a cracked wooden bench outside the bank, clutching my phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. I tried calling again, desperate, my fingers trembling, but the same cold mechanical voice echoed back at me. "This number has been blocked." I stared at the screen, heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the noise of the city around me. Ryan, my only son, my pride, my purpose, had erased me with a single click. I felt a hollowness seep into my chest, a sharp and cutting silence I couldn't outrun. People rushed by, arms full of shopping bags, children laughing, cars honking. The world spun forward like nothing had happened. But for me, everything had stopped. I sat frozen on that bench, wondering how it had come to this, how love, so carefully nurtured across decades, could be discarded so casually. I wiped a tear from my cheek with the sleeve of my sweater, steeling myself. I knew one thing. I couldn't sit here and break apart. Not today. Not for him. Somewhere deep inside, something stirred. A small, stubborn ember refusing to die out. Before we start, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. Before everything unraveled, my life was simple. Not perfect, not glamorous, but warm and full of small certainties that wrapped around me like a well-worn quilt. I lived in the same modest house I'd bought with my husband, Frank, decades ago. After he passed, it was just Ryan and me. It wasn't easy, raising a boy alone while working full-time as a school secretary, but I never once considered giving up. I packed lunches with handwritten notes tucked inside, cheered at every baseball game even when I didn't understand the rules, and spent late nights stitching Halloween costumes by hand because store-bought ones seemed too impersonal. Money was always tight, but I learned to stretch every dollar. I clipped coupons religiously, skipped vacations, bought secondhand clothes without complaint. Every time I deposited a few extra dollars into my savings account, I imagined it building a future for both of us. It wasn't just money. It was years of birthdays missed working overtime, of skipped dinners, of quiet sacrifices no one else ever saw. Ryan grew up knowing he was loved. I made sure of that. He had a roof over his head, a home-cooked meal every night, and a mother who would move mountains for him if she had to. He was a bright boy, charming and full of energy. I watched him graduate from high school, my chest swelling with pride as he crossed the stage in his cap and gown. He wasn't the most academically driven, but he had ambition, a hunger for success that I admired, even if it sometimes made me worry he was chasing too fast, too recklessly. After graduation, he bounced from one big dream to the next. First it was a tech startup, then real estate, then cryptocurrency investments. He spoke with such passion, such certainty, that it was easy to believe he was on the cusp of greatness. I didn't always understand the world he was trying to navigate, but I believed in him. I believed in us, in the bond that years of love and sacrifice had forged. Retirement was supposed to be the golden chapter. I had pictured it so clearly. Long walks in the park, volunteering at the library, maybe even traveling a little, places I had only seen in magazines. Most of all, I imagined having Ryan close again, maybe bringing a wife and grandchildren into the picture. Sunday dinners around the old oak table, family photos hung on the staircase wall, a house filled with laughter, not silence. I never doubted for a moment that the years of scraping and saving were worth it. I had built a future carefully, dollar by dollar, heartache by heartache. The idea of sharing it with Ryan, helping him launch his business, giving him a real shot at success, felt like the natural extension of everything I had spent my life working toward. When Ryan first floated the idea of needing some financial help, I barely hesitated. Of course I would help. What else was all of this for, if not for him? I didn't see it as a loan. I saw it as an investment in his future, in our future as a family. I pictured him flourishing, succeeding, eventually turning back to thank me with a smile and an embrace that would make every lonely holiday, every unpaid overtime hour, every empty birthday feel worth it. The night before I transferred the money, I sat at the kitchen table, the same one Frank and I had bought when Ryan was just a baby, and looked through old photo albums. Ryan grinning proudly in his Little League uniform, Ryan clutching his science fair trophy, Ryan hugging me tightly on Christmas mornings. Each photo was a promise, a memory of everything we had survived and celebrated together. As I signed the paperwork at the bank, I felt nervous, yes, but also hopeful. I imagined Ryan finally stepping into the man I always knew he could be. I imagined sitting front row at his success story, clapping louder than anyone else. I handed over my retirement savings without a second thought. Not because I was naive, not because I was careless, but because I loved him. And for most of my life, love had always been enough. Or so I thought. The first sign that something was wrong came so quietly I almost missed it. It was a crisp Saturday morning when Ryan dropped by the house. It wasn't unusual. He still had a key, and even though he hadn't been visiting much lately, I convinced myself he was just busy. He walked in without knocking, wearing a tailored jacket and new sneakers that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill. He barely glanced at me before plopping down at the kitchen table, scrolling endlessly on his phone. I made coffee the way he used to like it. 2 sugars, no cream, and slid a mug in front of him. He mumbled a thanks without looking up. For a moment, we sat in silence, the only sound the occasional buzz of his phone. I tried to fill the space, asking about his latest venture. Last I heard, he was working with a friend to launch some kind of app that would change the way people invested. Ryan shrugged. "It's going all right," he said, his eyes still glued to his screen. "But you know how it is. You need real money to make real money." I smiled and nodded, even though I didn't fully understand. I was just happy to have him here, to feel the house alive with his presence again. Then he laughed, a dry, almost bitter sound, and said, "You know, Mom, people your age just let money rot in banks. You should be doing something with it. It's dead money otherwise." I blinked, the words sinking into my chest like stones. I laughed it off awkwardly, assuming he was joking. I joked back, saying something about how I preferred my money safe and boring, like myself, but Ryan didn't smile. He just shook his head and muttered, "Yeah, well, boring doesn't build empires." The words stayed with me long after he left. They circled my mind like birds looking for a place to land. It wasn't what he said exactly. Ryan had always been bold, always a dreamer. It was the way he said it, dismissive, cold, like he saw me not as his mother, but as a gatekeeper to something he wanted. That night, after washing the dishes, I found myself standing at the kitchen window, staring out into the dark yard. The house felt too big, too empty. The silence wasn't comforting anymore. It pressed against me, heavy and suffocating. I thought about all the years I had spent saving, skipping new shoes, ignoring crumbling kitchen cabinets, patching up the roof myself when we couldn't afford repairs. I thought about every Christmas where I'd carefully tucked away a few dollars instead of buying myself something new. I hadn't been hoarding money. I had been protecting our future. And now, suddenly, it was dead money. I shook off the feeling. Maybe I was overreacting. Ryan was under a lot of pressure. Starting a business was stressful, and he was just venting. I told myself that. I forced myself to believe it because the alternative, that he saw me as an obstacle instead of a support, was too painful to accept. The next few times we spoke, little things piled up. He canceled dinner plans last minute because he had meetings with investors. He forgot my birthday, the first time ever. And when I reminded him, he laughed it off, saying he was too busy making moves. Each moment was small enough to explain away. Each cut was shallow enough to ignore. But somewhere deep down, a quiet unease began to grow. A small, persistent voice whispering that the son I had raised, the boy I had fed, clothed, loved, and believed in, was slipping away into someone I didn't fully recognize. Still, I clung to the memories. The late-night study sessions, the scraped knees I had kissed better, the whispered promises that he would always take care of me one day, just like I had taken care of him. Love demanded patience, I told myself. It demanded trust. So I buried the red flag under a mountain of hope, and I kept on believing, because believing was all I knew how to do. The distance between us didn't happen all at once. It was slow, like water seeping into the foundation of a house. Invisible at first, but eventually impossible to ignore. After that morning in the kitchen, Ryan's visits became less frequent. Days turned into weeks without a word. When I called, he answered with hurried voices, always in the middle of something urgent. Conversations that once flowed naturally were now clipped, mechanical. He was always about to jump on a call or running into a meeting. He barely asked about me anymore, about my health, my day, the little things that once connected us. At first, I blamed myself. Maybe I was bothering him too much. Maybe I was being too needy. I tried giving him space, waiting for him to call first, but the phone stayed silent. And with each empty day, the silence grew heavier. One Sunday, I baked his favorite, tin pecan pie, and sent him a message. Made your favorite. Would love to see you if you're free. Hours passed. No reply. I tried again the next morning. Nothing. 3 days later, he texted back. Been slammed, maybe next week. No apology, no warmth. Just cold transactional words. I left the pie untouched on the counter until it spoiled, unable to bring myself to throw it away. When he did visit, maybe once a month if that, he was different. Restless, distracted. He scrolled through his phone during conversations, nodded absently while I spoke, never truly hearing me. Sometimes I caught him glancing at the clock when I was mid-sentence, as if waiting for the right moment to leave. The boy who once begged me to stay up and watch movies with him now seemed eager to escape my company. It wasn't just the indifference. It was the tiny slights, the small dismissals that chipped away at me. When I mentioned a book I had read, he waved it off, saying, "Mom, no one reads anymore." When I tried to offer advice, old habits die hard. He smiled thinly and said, "You wouldn't understand how things work now." Each comment was a paper cut across a heart already worn thin. Tiny, almost invisible wounds. But they bled just the same. The home that once felt alive with laughter and conversation now echoed with quiet. I spent more evenings alone at the kitchen table, my fork scraping against a plate in a house too big for one person. I caught myself staring at the empty chair across from me, remembering all the nights Ryan sat there, talking about school, friends, dreams. Where'd that boy gone? Still, I made excuses. Maybe he was just stressed. Maybe he was ashamed he hadn't made it yet and didn't want to face me until he had something to brag about. I clung to those explanations, desperate to shield myself from the growing, gnawing feeling that our bond was fraying beyond repair. One afternoon, I dropped by his apartment without warning, something I never would have done before. I carried a small bag of groceries, just a few things I thought he might need, his favorite soup, some fresh fruit, a tin of cookies. I stood outside his door for a long time, debating whether to knock. When he finally answered, the look on his face wasn't joy or surprise. It was irritation. "You can't just show up, Mom. I'm really busy." I apologized, feeling foolish, and held out the bag. "Just a few things. Thought you might be low on groceries." He took it with a forced smile, barely glancing inside. He thanked me with a distracted pat on the shoulder and said he had to get back to work. I stood there in the hallway, clutching my purse, feeling like an intruder in the life I had helped build. When I got back to my car, I sat behind the wheel for a long time, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my hands ached. It wasn't just that he didn't have time for me. It was that he didn't seem to want time with me anymore. I drove home in silence that day, the radio off, the road blurring past me. Somewhere deep inside, I realized the boy who used to run into my arms when he scraped his knee, the young man who promised he would always take care of me one day. He was slipping further and further away, and I didn't know how to stop it. It was a Saturday afternoon when the humiliation finally sank its teeth in, the kind of day that stays with you long after the sting fades from your skin. Margot, my oldest friend, had invited me to a small gathering at her house. Nothing fancy, just a few close friends and family for a late lunch. Margot's daughter had just gotten engaged, and they wanted to celebrate. I almost didn't go. Ryan had promised he would stop by to help me fix a leaky faucet that morning, but when I called to confirm, he didn't answer. I waited for 2 hours, growing more embarrassed with each minute, before finally forcing myself to leave. When I arrived at Margot's, the backyard was filled with laughter, clinking glasses, and the delicious smell of barbecue. I made my way through the small crowd, greeting familiar faces, forcing smiles. Then, unexpectedly, I saw Ryan. He was standing in a tight circle with a few younger men I didn't recognize, laughing, holding a beer. My heart lifted instinctively. Maybe he had come after all. Maybe today would be different. I approached the group, hand raised in a small wave. "Hi, sweetheart." Ryan turned, looked at me for a moment too long, a blank, almost annoyed expression flashing across his face, then plastered on a wide, fake smile. "Hey guys, this is my mom," he said in a voice thick with forced humor. "She's still figuring out how the internet works." The group laughed, a light, casual laugh, but one that stung like a slap. I froze, my hand still half raised. I tried to laugh too, tried to make it seem like I was in on the joke, but it came out strangled and wrong. One of the men clapped Ryan on the back and said something about old school folks and dead investments. I didn't catch all the words, just enough to know they weren't meant kindly. I stood there awkwardly for a moment longer, my face burning. No one asked me to stay. No one tried to include me. Ryan had already turned his attention back to his friends, laughing at something else entirely. I slipped away quietly, weaving through the backyard crowd until I found a quiet spot near the fence. I pretended to check my phone, staring at the blank screen until the tears that threatened to spill finally receded. I didn't want anyone, especially Ryan, to see me cry. Margot found me a few minutes later. She didn't say anything, just gave me a knowing look and squeezed my hand. It should have comforted me, but it only deepened the shame curling in my stomach. For the rest of the afternoon, I smiled and made small talk, my heart miles away. I watched Ryan move easily among the crowd, laughing, charming, free, while I stood on the outside looking in, like a ghost haunting a life that used to be mine. Later that evening, when the sun dipped low and people started saying their goodbyes, Ryan gave me a quick hug, the kind you give an acquaintance, not someone you love, and mumbled something about catching up soon. I nodded, pretending not to notice the way he avoided my eyes. Driving home, I replayed the afternoon over and over in my mind. Each laugh, each dismissive glance, each wordless dismissal. They formed a jagged mosaic of where I now stood in Ryan's life. I wasn't his mother anymore. Not really. I was a relic, an obligation. Something to be tolerated, joked about, and then forgotten. At home, I sank into the old armchair in the living room, the one Ryan used to crawl into beside me when he was little. I traced the worn fabric with my fingertips, remembering the nights he fell asleep in my lap, trusting me to keep him safe. Somewhere along the way, that trust had been replaced by contempt. And the worst part was, I had let it happen. Inch by inch, moment by moment, because I had been too blinded by love to see the truth. That night, I didn't cry. I sat still, staring into the dark, feeling the slow, painful unraveling of something that had once been unbreakable. Love wasn't enough anymore, and for the first time, I wasn't sure it ever had been. The final break wasn't dramatic. It didn't happen with shouting or slammed doors. It happened the way most heartbreaks do, quietly in the small, heavy moments where you realize you're no longer wanted. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon when Ryan called. My heart leapt when I saw his name flash across the screen. A ridiculous, automatic reaction after so many months of being pushed aside. I answered on the second ring, trying to sound casual, hiding the excitement in my voice. "Hey, Mom," he said, his tone clipped, businesslike. "I was thinking about the money you said you were saving, your retirement fund." I felt my stomach tighten. We had talked about it in vague terms before, the nest egg I had spent decades building, but I had always kept it separate, sacred. It wasn't just money. It was safety, freedom, a lifetime's worth of tiny sacrifices stacked one on top of the other. I was thinking, Ryan continued. It's just sitting there, doing nothing. Meanwhile, I'm trying to grow my business, and every day that passes, we lose opportunities. We. He said it like it was ours, like the years I spent patching roofs, skipping meals, saying no to every little luxury were a shared burden. I just need a little bit to really push this to the next level, he said. Alone, you'll get it back, plus interest. I hesitated. My instincts screamed at me to slow down, to ask questions. But then Ryan's voice softened. That boyish, earnest tone I hadn't heard in so long. Come on, Mom, trust me. You always believed in me. Just one more time. How could I say no to that? How could I refuse the son I had spent a lifetime lifting up? I told him I'd think about it. That night, I barely slept. I sat at the kitchen table staring at my bank statements, the numbers blurring together. I thought about the future I had imagined, the quiet retirement, the freedom from worry. And I thought about Ryan, full of hope and ambition, standing on the edge of something he believed was great. By morning, I had made my decision. I called the bank, arranged the transfer. I told myself it wasn't giving up my future. It was securing his. That was worth more than any safety net. I texted Ryan to let him know the money was on the way. He responded almost instantly. Thanks, Mom. You won't regret this. Those were the last words I heard from him for a very long time. At first, I made excuses. Maybe he was busy. Maybe the business was taking off and he was swamped. I told myself he would call, would stop by, would show up one day with flowers and a huge grin, saying, "We did it, Mom." But the days stretched into weeks, then months. Every time I called, it went straight to voicemail. My messages sat unread. I checked his social media, something I had never really understood how to use, and saw pictures of him at parties, on trips, posing next to flashy cars that didn't look anything like the struggling entrepreneur he claimed to be. The realization came slowly, painfully. He wasn't busy. He wasn't struggling. He had simply moved on, without me. The final blow came when I tried calling him from a different number, Margot's phone. I thought maybe he had lost mine. Maybe it was all a misunderstanding. But when he picked up and heard my voice, there was a pause. And then the line went dead. Blocked. Not just ignored, blocked. I sat there in Margot's kitchen, the phone heavy in my lap, feeling the last thread between us snap. There was no confrontation, no shouting match, no dramatic goodbye, just silence. And the slow, devastating realization that I had handed over everything, my savings, my trust, my dreams, to someone who had no intention of ever looking back. I didn't tell anyone right away. I couldn't bear the pitying looks, the whispered judgments. Instead, I withdrew from the world. I stopped going to the library, stopped baking, stopped reaching out. I became a ghost in my own life, drifting through the days, haunted by the memory of a son who had once run into my arms and whispered, "I'll always take care of you, Mom." I didn't leave Ryan's life. He pushed me out, so gently, so cleanly, that it took me months to realize I was standing outside the door, alone, and it was never going to open again. Rock bottom wasn't a single moment. It was a slow, grinding erosion that wore me down until I no longer recognized myself. It started in small, almost invisible ways. Bills that once felt manageable now loomed like shadows. The heater broke in November, right as the nights turned sharp and unforgiving. I bundled myself in blankets, convincing myself it wasn't that cold, that it wasn't worth dipping into what little savings I had left. The grocery list grew shorter each week. I clipped coupons again, like I had when Ryan was little, but this time it wasn't a choice. It was survival. Friends called, but I found reasons not to answer. I couldn't stand the thought of explaining. Or worse, lying. I couldn't bear hearing the kindness in their voices, kindness I knew I didn't deserve because deep down I blamed myself. I stopped baking. The kitchen, once filled with the smell of fresh bread and pies cooling on the counter, now sat silent. The television flickered in the evenings, filling the empty house with canned laughter and drama that didn't touch me. I spent more hours than I care to admit sitting by the window, staring out at a world that no longer felt like mine. One afternoon, a letter arrived from the power company. Bright red ink stamped across the envelope. Final notice. I held it in my hands, numb. How had it come to this? How had a lifetime of hard work and careful planning crumbled into fear over keeping the lights on? I wanted to call Ryan. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, to make him see what he had done. But I didn't. I already knew what would happen. The cold, empty silence or the blocked line. He had made his choice, and somewhere deep inside I knew I had made mine too, long before the money ever left my account. I had chosen to believe in him over believing in myself. One evening, as winter settled hard over the neighborhood, I sat in the living room with only the flicker of an old lamp for light. The heater was still broken. I wore 3 sweaters and 2 pairs of socks, but the cold seeped into my bones. I watched my own breath cloud the air and thought, this is it. This is how you disappear. The house, once filled with Ryan's footsteps, his laughter, his music blaring upstairs, was now just wood and drywall and empty echoes. The memories hurt more than the cold. The lowest point came not with a crash, but with a whisper. It was a Thursday night when the realization truly settled in. The kind of realization that cleaves through your chest and leaves you hollow. I was sitting at the kitchen table staring at a single slice of stale bread on a plate, when I thought, maybe no one would notice if I just disappeared. Not Ryan, not anymore. I pushed the thought away, horrified at myself, but it clung to me, wrapping around my ribs like a slow, suffocating vine. That night, I crawled into bed, fully dressed, too tired to change, too numb to cry. I lay there in the dark, the streetlights casting long, thin shadows across the ceiling. The clock ticked louder with each passing second, a relentless reminder that another day was ending exactly as the last one had, in silence. I don't know how long I lay awake, hours maybe. The world outside moved on without me. Somewhere, Ryan was probably laughing with friends, making plans, dreaming of his next big move. I was a closed chapter in his story, a forgotten paragraph. Lying there, I realized that the love I had poured so freely, so fiercely into Ryan had left me empty. I had spent decades building a future for someone who no longer even saw me. I was cold. I was alone. I was tired. And for the first time in my life, I didn't know if I had the strength to keep believing that things could get better. That was rock bottom, not the broken heater, not the empty bank account, not even the silence from my only child. Rock bottom was the moment I realized I had lost not just my savings, not just my security, but a part of myself. The part that still believed love was enough. It happened on a night like so many others, cold, silent, heavy with disappointment. I couldn't sleep. Again. The weight of everything, the empty savings account, the unpaid bills, the hollow ache of loneliness, sat on my chest like a stone. I shuffled around the house in my worn slippers, aimlessly tidying, wiping clean counters that were already spotless, straightening picture frames that hadn't been touched in years. In the living room closet, buried behind boxes of old Christmas decorations and photo albums, I found a weathered accordion file where I kept important documents. It had been years since I'd looked through it. I sat cross-legged on the floor, thumbing through old paperwork, birth certificates, mortgage papers, tax returns, pieces of a life that suddenly felt like it belonged to someone else. Near the back, I found it, a manila envelope labeled in Ryan's handwriting. Curious, I pulled it out and opened it carefully. Inside were a few sheets of paper I vaguely remembered signing months ago when Ryan had convinced me to help formalize things for his business loan. At the time, I hadn't read them closely. I had trusted him. I had trusted that whatever he needed, it was harmless, that he would never do anything to hurt me. But something about tonight, maybe the silence, maybe the cold, made me read the fine print for the first time. My eyes scanned the page slowly at first, then faster, my heart thudding in my ears. Tucked in between technical jargon and legal language was a single clause, highlighted faintly in yellow. Borrower agrees to full repayment with interest within 12 months of receipt. Failure to repay may result in legal action. I sat back on my heels, stunned. I hadn't just given Ryan my savings. Legally, he had borrowed it, and he had signed his name to that promise. All this time, I had assumed I was helpless, that there was no way to reclaim what I had lost. But here it was, my lifeline, my small sliver of justice, hidden in a forgotten folder in a dusty closet. At first, I didn't know what to feel. Relief? Rage? Hope? None of it came clearly. I just sat there staring at the page, my mind whirring with possibilities. This discovery didn't erase the betrayal. It didn't bring back the warmth or trust we once shared. But it gave me something I hadn't felt in months. It gave me a choice. I stood up slowly, my knees creaking from the cold floor. I clutched the papers to my chest as if they were something sacred. They weren't just documents. They were proof that I wasn't crazy, that I wasn't foolish for wanting to believe in something better. For months I had lived under the weight of shame, blaming myself, questioning every decision, every instinct. But now, for the first time, I saw the truth clearly. Trusting Ryan hadn't been the mistake. Trusting him without protecting myself had. The house was silent around me, the old clock ticking steadily in the background. I walked into the kitchen, turned on the small lamp over the sink, and laid the papers down on the table. They looked so ordinary, so unassuming, and yet they represented a quiet power I hadn't realized I still held. In the stillness of that kitchen, something inside me shifted. Not a roaring fire, not a bolt of rage, just a steady, simmering resolve. I wasn't powerless, I wasn't invisible, and I wasn't done. The woman who had spent decades scraping and saving, loving and sacrificing, wasn't going to vanish quietly into the cold. I had spent my life protecting Ryan. Maybe it was time to protect myself. That night, I made a decision. I didn't know exactly what steps I would take. I didn't know what the road ahead would look like. But I knew this. I would not let betrayal define me. I would not let heartbreak be the final chapter of my story. The papers sat under the soft pool of lamplight, waiting. So was I. For the first time in months, I slept through the night. Waking up the next morning, I felt different. It wasn't a grand transformation or some fiery surge of confidence. It was quieter, deeper, a steady thrum in my chest, like something solid had shifted back into place. I stood in the kitchen with my cup of black coffee, the morning light leaking in through the thin curtains. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't dreading the day. I wasn't sinking under the weight of helplessness. Instead, I felt rooted, steady, capable. The papers sat neatly stacked on the kitchen table, exactly where I had left them. I reached out and rested my hand over them, not clutching them desperately like before, but touching them with a quiet respect. They weren't just a legal technicality. They were a reminder that my story wasn't over yet. After breakfast, I pulled out a worn notebook from the drawer, the same one I used to track grocery budgets and home repairs over the years. I sat down and made a list, not a list of everything I had lost, a list of everything I still had. My home paid off, my mind sharp and clear, friends like Margot who still cared, and now, evidence, a small but powerful path forward. I realized something else as I stared at that list. For months I had been waiting. For Ryan to call, to apologize, to make things right. Waiting had become a habit, but what had waiting given me? Only more loneliness, only more pain. If I wanted something to change, it had to start with me, not him, not anyone else. So I got dressed. Not in my usual oversized sweaters and worn jeans, but in a crisp blouse and slacks I hadn't worn in months. I brushed my hair, applied a little lipstick, and looked at myself in the mirror. The woman who stared back wasn't a victim. She wasn't invisible. She was still standing. I gathered the documents carefully, slid them into a manila folder, and tucked them under my arm. My hands shook a little as I reached for my car keys. Not from fear, but from the adrenaline of finally moving, finally choosing action over sorrow. I didn't have a plan yet, not fully. I just knew the first step. Find out what my rights were. Find out what could be done. Driving into town, I realized how much of my world had shrunk over the past year. Streets that once felt familiar now seemed foreign. New shops had popped up, old ones had disappeared. Life had gone on without me, and for the first time, I didn't resent it. I was ready to rejoin it, even if it was scary. I parked outside the small law office where Margot's cousin, David Langston, practiced. I hadn't called ahead. I hadn't even told Margot yet. I just walked through the door, the little bell chiming overhead, and approached the receptionist. "Hi," I said, my voice clear and steady. "I need to speak to someone about financial fraud." The words tasted strange on my tongue, sharp and real, but they didn't feel shameful anymore. They felt right. David met with me an hour later. He was kind, professional, and didn't treat me like a helpless old woman. I showed him the papers, explained everything carefully, answering his questions without flinching. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, studying me for a long moment. "You have a case, Mrs. Carter," he said. "A strong one." Hearing those words, hearing someone confirm that I hadn't imagined the betrayal, that I had rights, that I mattered, sent a tremor through me. Not fear, strength. David laid out the options. Formal letters of demand, court filings if necessary, even restitution for damages. It wouldn't be easy, he warned. It could get ugly. Ryan might fight it. He might say things I wasn't prepared to hear. But for once, I didn't feel paralyzed by the thought. I felt prepared. Not for a battle against Ryan exactly, but for a battle for myself. That afternoon, as I signed the first set of documents to start the process, I realized something vital. I wasn't doing this for revenge. I wasn't doing this to hurt Ryan. I was doing it to stand up for the woman who had spent her life giving and loving without asking for much in return. The woman who deserved better. The woman who was finally, quietly, waking up. After I left David Langston's office, a strange calm settled over me. It wasn't relief exactly. It was a deeper kind of steadiness, like setting your feet on solid ground after drifting at sea for too long. For the first time in months, I wasn't waiting on Ryan's call. I wasn't checking my phone, hoping for an apology that would never come. I was done waiting. I was moving. But I didn't tell anyone. Not Margot. Not the few friends who still called now and then. Certainly not Ryan. I didn't want sympathy. I didn't want advice. I wanted quiet, deliberate action. Without fanfare, without drama. David filed the first official demand letter within a week. It was crisp, professional, and devastating in its simplicity. Repay the loan in full within 30 days or face legal action. We sent it certified mail to the last address we had for Ryan. I imagined him opening that envelope, the shock, the scramble to figure out how to respond. But I didn't dwell on it. This wasn't about him anymore. It was about me. Meanwhile, I started making small changes around my life. At first, they were almost invisible to anyone else, but they felt monumental to me. I reorganized the house, giving away old things I no longer needed. Old clothes, knickknacks, furniture, gathering dust. Every bag I dropped off at the donation center felt like shedding a layer of grief. I took on a few shifts at the local library, where they needed help shelving books and running the checkout desk. It wasn't much money, but it wasn't about the paycheck. It was about reclaiming a part of myself, the part that believed she still had something valuable to offer the world. I also started a savings jar on my kitchen counter. Every time I earned a few extra dollars, I dropped them in with a quiet sense of pride. It was laughable, in a way. A small jar, a few crumpled bills, compared to everything I had lost. But it represented something far bigger than money. It represented the beginning of building my life again, brick by brick, on my own terms. I didn't call Ryan. I didn't text him. I let the silence do the work. He wasn't used to that. For years, I had been the one to patch things up, to call first, to forgive without being asked. But this time, I stayed still. I didn't chase. I didn't beg. I let the natural consequences unfold. A few weeks later, David informed me that Ryan had signed for the letter but hadn't responded. That was fine. We were already preparing the next step, filing a formal lawsuit for repayment. The paperwork was dense, full of legal language I barely understood, but David walked me through every part of it patiently, making sure I knew exactly what we were doing. At night, I would sit at the kitchen table, sipping tea, staring at the documents spread out before me. They didn't scare me, not anymore. They empowered me. They were a testament to the quiet strength I had finally found within myself. And the best part? No one else knew. There were no Facebook posts, no angry phone calls to friends, no scenes played out in public. It was a silent setup, just me taking back my life, step by careful step. There was a strange kind of dignity in it, in choosing not to scream, not to beg for justice, but to simply build it, quietly and firmly, one action at a time. Margot asked me once if I had heard from Ryan. I just smiled and said, "No, but I'm doing fine." And it was the truth. The fear that used to gnaw at me when I thought of confronting him was gone. In its place was something stronger, peace. Because no matter what happened next, whether Ryan tried to fight the case, whether he came crawling back with excuses, I knew I wouldn't be shaken. I had already survived the worst part, losing the illusion of who he was. Now, every day I lived was proof that I could survive the rest. In the quiet of those days, filing paperwork, rebuilding savings, volunteering at the library, I realized something powerful. Reclaiming your life doesn't have to be loud. It doesn't have to be messy. It just has to be yours. And mine was finally starting to feel like mine again. It didn't happen overnight, but slowly, surely I could feel the ground beneath my feet becoming steadier, and the ground beneath Ryan's beginning to crack. The first real sign came a few weeks after the lawsuit was formally filed. I was shelving books at the library when my phone buzzed with a message from David. Ryan's attorney reached out. They want to talk settlement. I stood frozen for a moment, the spine of a novel resting against my palm, not because I was scared, but because it finally hit me. He knew he couldn't outrun this. He knew he was losing control, and I wasn't chasing after him this time. He was the one scrambling now. I slipped the book back onto the shelf, straightened my cardigan, and went back to work without replying immediately. The old Evelyn, the one who would have dropped everything to respond, to resolve, to fix, was gone. I would answer on my terms. Over the next few days, the shifts became even more obvious. Ryan tried calling my old cell number, the one I had since disconnected. He sent a generic email to an address I barely used anymore, asking me to talk things out before it gets ugly. It was full of excuses, half-hearted apologies, vague promises of paying me back when things stabilize. I didn't answer. For years, Ryan had relied on my softness, my need to hold our relationship together, but he didn't understand something vital. Silence is a language too, and now it was the only one I spoke to him. David handled all communication, cool and professional. Each time Ryan's side tried to wiggle out, claiming financial hardship, offering partial repayments, suggesting creative solutions, David responded with quiet firmness. Full repayment plus damages, or we proceed to trial. No emotion, no threats, just facts. It drove Ryan crazy. Friends began to whisper about him. Small things at first. Someone mentioned seeing Ryan sell off some of his expensive electronics. Another said he had quietly closed down his business venture. A few whispered rumors floated back to me about him moving out of his luxury apartment into a smaller place on the edge of town. I didn't gloat. I didn't celebrate. I simply absorbed it, breathing it in like oxygen after months underwater. For the first time in this long, painful journey, the balance was shifting, and it had nothing to do with revenge. It was about justice, about finally seeing that I wasn't powerless, no matter how many times I'd been treated like I was disposable. I was reclaiming my dignity without lifting a single finger in anger. No yelling, no scenes, just quiet, relentless truth. One afternoon, as I sat outside on the porch sipping tea, I caught myself smiling. Not because Ryan was suffering, but because I wasn't anymore. The memories still hurt. The ache of betrayal wasn't something that disappeared with legal victories or repayments. But the power Ryan once held over my happiness, it was gone. I decided to take small joys seriously again. Planting flowers in the front yard, baking a peach pie just for myself, going to the Sunday market and buying fresh apples without worrying about every single dollar. Each step forward, no matter how small, built a life that didn't depend on Ryan or his approval. And Ryan? He was now reacting to my moves, not the other way around. He could no longer dismiss me as old-fashioned or out of touch. He could no longer take what he wanted and leave me broken in the aftermath. I was no longer the one knocking at a closed door. He was the one locked outside, watching a door he couldn't open again, no matter how many times he knocked. The power had shifted, not because I fought him on his terms, but because I learned to fight on mine. By standing still, by standing strong, by refusing to be erased, and the quiet strength I had found, the strength that grew in lonely nights, unpaid bills, cold mornings, and silent afternoons, was stronger than anything he could throw at me now. The foundation of my life was being rebuilt, not from what I had lost, but from everything I had discovered about myself. And this time, it wasn't built for anyone else's approval. It was built for me. The confrontation, when it finally came, wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't happen with shouting across a lawyer's table or a screaming match on a front porch. It happened in a quiet office, under the steady hum of fluorescent lights, with a simple, undeniable truth laid bare between us. David had arranged a mediation meeting, one last opportunity to settle before taking the case to trial. It was standard procedure, but it felt like more than that. It felt like a reckoning. I sat at the long conference table, documents neatly organized in front of me. David sat beside me, calm and unreadable. Across the room, the door opened and Ryan walked in. I hadn't seen him in nearly a year. At first glance, he looked the same. Confident, polished. But when he sat down across from me, I noticed the cracks, the dark circles under his eyes, the tightness in his jaw, the way he avoided looking directly at me. For a brief moment, the mother in me wanted to rush to him, to smooth his hair, to tell him everything would be all right. But I stayed still. Because some lessons have to be learned the hard way. Ryan's lawyer opened with a rehearsed speech about misunderstandings and unfortunate communication gaps. He tried to paint Ryan as overwhelmed, young, inexperienced, not malicious. I listened without flinching. When they finished, David spoke clearly. My client's position remains unchanged. Full repayment with damages. No negotiation. The room fell into a heavy silence. Finally, Ryan spoke. "Mom," he said, and the words sounded foreign coming from his mouth. "You don't have to do this. We're family. We can work this out, just the two of us." I looked at him then. Really looked at him. The charm, the quick smiles, the promises. All the tools he had used for years to win me over. They were still there, but they no longer moved me. I placed my hands flat on the table, steady and sure. "We are family," I said, "and that's exactly why this hurts so much. But love doesn't excuse betrayal. Trust doesn't excuse theft." He opened his mouth to argue, but I raised a hand, stopping him. "You made a choice, Ryan. You chose to block my number. You chose to walk away. You chose not to fix it." He stared at me, stunned, as if seeing me for the first time. "Now," I continued, voice firm but calm, "I'm making my choice, to stand up for myself, to reclaim what's mine, without anger, without hatred, just truth." David slid a copy of the repayment agreement across the table. "Sign it or we proceed to court," he said simply. For a long moment, Ryan just sat there, the paper in front of him like a loaded weapon. His fingers twitched, his face flushed. He looked at me, perhaps expecting a last-minute softening, a crack in my armor, but there was none. Finally, with a sharp breath, he grabbed the pen and scribbled his signature, angry, bitter, defeated. It wasn't a victory I celebrated. It wasn't sweet or satisfying. It was sad, but necessary. As Ryan pushed the signed papers back toward David, he muttered under his breath, "I hope you're happy." I met his eyes, steady and clear. "I'm not happy," I said. "I'm at peace." And that was the truth. He left without another word, the door clicking shut behind him. For a long time after he was gone, I sat at that conference table, letting the silence wash over me. I hadn't shouted, I hadn't pleaded, I hadn't begged for love or understanding. I had simply stood up, and it had been enough. David gathered the papers and offered a small nod of respect. I smiled back, feeling lighter than I had in years. On the drive home, the world looked different somehow. Clearer, sharper. Not because Ryan had been punished, but because I had finally honored myself. In the rearview mirror, the sun dipped low, setting the sky ablaze with deep oranges and purples. It felt fitting, a chapter ending, a new one beginning. And for the first time in a long, long time, I didn't feel lost. I felt found. Weeks passed after the mediation, and life began settling into a different rhythm, one built around small, deliberate joys. I wasn't waiting by the phone anymore. I wasn't stalking Ryan's social media, looking for signs of regret. I had finally closed the door, locked it, and walked away with my dignity intact. Then came the final twist, the moment that sealed the justice I never thought I'd see. One afternoon, David called. I answered calmly, expecting another routine update, but his voice had a different energy this time, a quiet satisfaction. "You're going to want to hear this," he said. Ryan hadn't just been forced to repay what he owed me. As it turned out, the investigation triggered by our case had unearthed something much bigger, a pattern. Ryan had done the same thing, or tried to, with two other investors. Older clients, people he had befriended and convinced to invest in phantom business ventures. In my heart, I had suspected I wasn't the only one. Hearing it confirmed was still a punch to the gut. David explained that authorities were building a larger case. Financial misconduct, fraud, elder exploitation, serious charges. Ones that could leave a permanent stain on Ryan's record, not just legally but publicly. For a long moment, I sat in silence, processing it. I hadn't set out to ruin Ryan's life. I had only wanted to reclaim what was mine, to stand up for the part of me that he thought was too easy to silence. But his choices, all of them, had caught up with him. He hadn't just stolen from me. He had built a life around taking, and now it was crumbling. Weeks later, it hit the local news. A small blurb at first, then bigger stories. Local entrepreneur faces fraud allegations. Multiple victims come forward in investment scam. I saw Ryan's photo once, scrolling past on a news website. His usual cocky grin was replaced by a hollow, exhausted stare. A mugshot followed not long after. Public humiliation, legal consequences, real accountability. I thought seeing it would make me feel triumphant. I thought it might spark a flicker of satisfaction, but it didn't. Instead, I felt a deep, quiet sadness. Not because Ryan didn't deserve to face the truth, but because I had once loved him with a kind of blind, unshakable faith, and he had squandered it. Not just with me, but with anyone who ever tried to believe in him. There was a final court hearing regarding financial restitution. I wasn't required to attend, but I did. Not for revenge, for closure. Ryan sat at the defense table, shoulders slumped, his once perfect suit wrinkled and ill-fitting. He didn't look at me once during the proceedings, not when the judge spoke sternly about betrayal of trust, not when they detailed the restitution he owed not just to me, but to the others he had deceived. When the judge finalized the judgment, my hands stayed perfectly still in my lap. No clapping, no tears, just quiet finality. Afterward, I stepped outside the courthouse, blinking into the crisp air. Reporters stood near the steps, but they weren't there for me. No one wanted a quote from the woman who refused to be broken, and that was fine by me. I didn't need the world to know what I had survived. I knew. That was enough. Later that evening, sitting by my window with a cup of tea, warming my hands, I thought about everything that had unfolded. The betrayal, the humiliation, the cold nights and the empty days, the small steps back toward life, the silent setup, the steady, unstoppable reclaiming of my own worth. Justice had come, but not in the way I once imagined. Not as a grand, sweeping victory, but as a quiet, undeniable truth. I had won the most important battle of all, the one for my own soul. And Ryan? He had to face a world where charm and excuses were no longer enough. As the sun slipped behind the horizon, casting long shadows across my living room floor, I realized something powerful. The person who had been lost, the woman who had once been so full of hope, so willing to believe, so quick to forgive, was not broken beyond repair. She had simply evolved, stronger, wiser, unbreakable. It was almost 6 months after the court ruling when Ryan showed up again. I was out in the front yard, pruning the rose bushes. It was early spring, and the air carried that fresh, earthy scent of new beginnings. I had just snipped a thorny branch when I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. I turned and saw a familiar car pulling into the driveway, a car I hadn't seen since everything fell apart. Ryan stepped out slowly, awkwardly, like he wasn't sure if he should be there. His shoulders sagged under a thin jacket that looked a size too big. He wasn't the polished young man who had once sauntered into my kitchen with grand plans and bigger promises. He looked smaller now, diminished. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I wiped my gardening gloves on my jeans, watching him. My heart beat steadily, not racing with anger, not fluttering with hope, just steady. I had braced myself for this moment without even realizing it. Finally, he took a few hesitant steps forward. "Mom," he started, his voice cracking on the word. "Can we talk?" I considered it. I had every right to turn him away, to protect the peace I had fought so hard to reclaim. But something inside me, something older, wiser, nudged me toward compassion. "You can come in for tea," I said simply, "but that's all." Inside, the house smelled faintly of cinnamon and fresh laundry. I led him to the kitchen and put the kettle on the stove, moving with the easy rhythm of a woman who no longer needed anyone's approval. Ryan sat at the table, the same table where I had once signed away my retirement savings, with a hopeful heart. He fidgeted with the corner of a placemat, his gaze darting around the room as if he was trying to memorize it. When the tea was ready, I placed a cup in front of him and sat down across the table. We sat in silence for a moment, steam curling up between us. "I messed up," he said finally, a voice low. "I know I hurt you. I know I betrayed everything you gave me." I didn't rush to fill the space. I let him sit in it, let him feel the weight of his own words. "I lost everything," he continued. "The businesses, the friends, even the apartment. I didn't just hurt you. I destroyed myself too." I nodded slightly, acknowledging his words without rescuing him from them. "I'm not here to ask for anything," he added quickly. I don't know. I guess I just needed you to know that I'm sorry." He looked at me then, really looked at me. And for the first time in a long time, there was no arrogance, no bravado. Just a tired, broken young man who had finally run out of excuses. I wrapped my hands around my teacup, feeling the warmth seep into my palms. "Thank you for saying that," I said quietly. "It matters." Relief flickered across his face. A fleeting, fragile thing. "But," I continued, voice steady, "I need you to understand something. Saying sorry doesn't erase what happened. It doesn't rebuild trust overnight." He nodded, eyes glistening. "I forgive you, Ryan," I said, "but forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting, and it's not an invitation to come back into my life as if nothing happened." I saw him flinch slightly, but he didn't argue. Maybe, finally, he understood. "I'm building something new now," I said. "And if you want to be part of it one day, it has to be on different terms. Terms I set." He swallowed hard and nodded again. We sat there for a few more minutes, sipping our tea, letting the silence stretch between us. Not heavy this time, but honest. When he stood to leave, he hesitated, as if expecting a hug, a promise, a crack in the wall I had so carefully rebuilt. But I stayed seated, not out of cruelty, out of love, real love, the kind that knows when to hold on and when to let go. He walked out the door without asking for anything more, and I let him go. Not with bitterness, not with resentment, but with peace. Because I didn't need him to validate me anymore. I didn't need him to fix what was broken. I had already done that myself. And as the door clicked shut behind him, the house remained full, not of regrets, but of strength, of quiet, steady hope, of me. The days after Ryan's visit passed quietly, like a slow-moving river smoothing out jagged stones. I returned to my routines: mornings at the library, afternoons in the garden, evenings curled up with a book or a simple homemade dinner. Life wasn't flashy or perfect, but it was mine again, shaped by my own two hands, and that was enough. I found myself drawn more often to the front porch in the early evenings, sitting in the old rocking chair Frank had built so many years ago. It creaked with every gentle sway, a comforting sound against the backdrop of chirping crickets and the distant hums of the town settling down for the night. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the trees, setting the sky ablaze with streaks of gold and crimson, I sat there with a cup of tea in my hands and let myself breathe in everything I had survived. It wasn't just the betrayal. It wasn't just the money. It was the slow unraveling of the life I had built, and the quiet, patient work of weaving something new from the frayed threads. I thought about Ryan, about the boy he once was and the man he had become. I had loved him fiercely, blindly at times, and that love had left scars. But it had also taught me the most important lesson of my life. Love without boundaries isn't love, it's sacrifice. And true love, real healthy love, requires respect, honesty, and care, not just from others, but from yourself. For a long time, I had believed that being a good mother meant giving everything without question, without pause. I thought unconditional love meant unconditional tolerance. But now I knew better. Loving someone doesn't mean abandoning yourself. It doesn't mean handing over your dreams, your dignity, or your future. It means standing strong even when it hurts. It means holding the line, not out of anger, but out of deep, unwavering self-respect. As the sun disappeared behind the horizon, the first stars pricked the darkening sky. I wrapped a shawl around my shoulders and smiled softly to myself. The house behind me was smaller than it once felt, quieter, but not empty. It was full of resilience, full of lessons hard won, full of peace. There were still scars, moments when grief pinched at the edges of my heart, birthdays missed, holidays spent apart, the faint ache of what could have been if things had gone differently. But there was also pride. Pride in having stood up when it mattered, pride in having fought, not for revenge, but for my own worth. Pride in having reclaimed a life that belonged to me. I thought about the young woman I had once been, full of dreams and hope, willing to give everything for those she loved. I honored her. I forgave her, and I honored the woman I had become. Wiser, stronger, less willing to lose herself for anyone else. As the evening deepened and the cool air kissed my cheeks, I realized something simple and profound. Survival isn't just about holding on. It's about knowing when to let go. I had let go of Ryan. Not the love I still felt for him, but the need to fix him, to save him, to be the glue holding together a relationship he had chosen to break. I had let go of regret, the endless what-ifs and why-didn'ts that used to haunt my sleepless nights. I had let go of shame, the cruel, silent judgment I had once turned inward when everything fell apart. And in letting go, I had made room for new joys, new connections, new beginnings. The stars above me blinked and shimmered, ancient and steady. I rocked gently in my chair, the creaking sound blending into the symphony of the night. This was my life now, not broken, not perfect, but whole. Built not on promises made by others, but on promises I made to myself. To stand strong, to love wisely, and to never again forget that my own heart mattered too. I sipped the last of my tea, savoring its warmth. Tomorrow would come with its small routines and quiet triumphs. Tomorrow would come and I would meet it not with fear but with open arms, because I was still here, still standing, still choosing myself, every single day. And that, I realized, was the greatest victory of all.